Great, well, a formal welcome. Thank you for coming along tonight, and to those who are online. We're delighted to have so many people joining us this year and at this new venue of the Boardwalk. So indeed, we're very grateful to you all for making the time to come along tonight, and we trust you've enjoyed some Fairtrade wine and other refreshments. And for those at home, we hope you've had something to Fairtrade, of course. So we first hosted a Fairtrade Nation lecture in 2013 when we achieved Fairtrade Nation status. And since then, on an annual basis, we've had a range of really good and significant guest lecturers speaking about all sorts of different aspects of fair trade. And this evening, we are very pleased to have Michael Gidney here as our guest lecturer. Michael has been the Chief Executive of the Fairtrade Foundation since 2012, so has a wealth of experience, and is also a good friend of the Scottish Fairtrade Forum, both as the organisation and individually, and I'm sure many of you will recognise Michael when he joined us for the celebrations for the 10 years of the Scottish Fairtrade Nation. So a good friend, and we're delighted to welcome you. And it's particularly appropriate that Michael's with us this year because, as I'm sure we all know, it's the 30th anniversary of the Fairtrade mark this year. So I'm looking forward, as I'm sure you are too, to hearing what he has to say about the successes and challenges of those 30 years, and even more importantly, to look at the price, power and pace of the future. So please welcome Michael. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz, and thank you everybody on the forum for a really warm welcome. And it does feel a little like coming home when I come here. I just find the everything you do in the Scottish campaign just incredibly inspiring, and it gives me energy when I go home. So thank you for that. And hello everybody online. I want to take a little journey. I want to do a little bit of time travel to start. So I want you to cast your minds back 30 years. To 1994. And some of you may not have been born in 1994, but quite a lot of us were, okay? So if you can think back to 1994, there was barely any internet, there was no social media, phones were for making calls, do you remember those? Rather than sorting your entire life out. And in films, we had the launch of The Lion King, which has become a kind of cornerstone now, hasn't it? Friends, the TV show, had its first airing, and it's now, on every channel all of the time, it seems to me. And it was the premiere of 4 Weddings and a Funeral, which again just seems like wallpaper now. Imagine a time before these things existed. It's extraordinary. Also, 1994 was the first, the year that women were ordained as priests. It was the year Eurotunnel opened. Before 94, we were not connected to France in that way. Also, 1994 was the early years of Britpop and the rise of some amazing new bands. And so for me, it's kind of extraordinary that in 1994, the biggest selling single of the year was, any guesses? No, not Supersonic. Good guess though. Do you know, it was even worse than Wet Wet Wet. It was Love Is, oh, well, it was Wet Wet, Love Is All Around. So it was the theme tune from 4 Weddings to Funeral. And yes, that was the biggest selling single of 1994. How marvellous our tastes were at the time, right? So the past, they say, is a foreign country. They do things differently there. And how true that is. And how true it's been also when you think about the world of trade and the world of fair trade. And I want to, in talking to you tonight, to try and gallop through some of the changes that we've seen over the last 30 years, the good and the bad, and think what that actually means for what we're trying to do in the fair trade world, and to maybe put some ideas forward for the future. So, thinking about trade in the 90s, what was it like for consumers? Again, it's so hard to think back to those pre-internet days, to the days before online shopping and all that went with it. But actually, life for consumers in the 1990s was pretty good. We were coming out of the recession. Consumerism, consumer markets were absolutely top of mind. There was a flourishing of brands, colourful, attractive brands, taking your money and giving you these wonderful lifestyle propositions in return. Advertising was in the ascendant. Consumer choice absolutely trumped all other concerns. I was looking back the other day at a Maxwell House coffee ad from 1994. And it was fascinating to see it because it was a sort of big hot air balloon wafting over the kind of coffee fields. And there were close-ups of the coffee beans and the coffee sacks, not a single shot of a farmer. So this story that they were showing you of this beautiful world where coffee comes from actually didn't have any people in it. And I think that's really fascinating. And just a little snapshot into the way the kind of consumer story was unfolding in the 90s. So what was it like for businesses in the 90s? Again, cast your mind back if you can. And I think actually also pretty good. I mean, you know, a very summary statement, but decisions were made in UK boardrooms by UK teams, mostly without consultation. It was a buyer's market, particularly thinking about the kinds of tropical agricultural commodities that we have all been involved in the fair trade movement. Companies also, more broadly, could act more or less with impunity. Those of you who are old enough will remember Ken Saro-Wiwa, the campaigner for rights of the Ogoni people in Nigeria, campaigning against the grotesque environmental destruction of their traditional lands because of oil exploration. And of course, what happened to him in the 90s was he was hanged by the regime in what to the rest of us in the outside world looked like a knee-jerk response to the power of big corporates. I remember at the time, quite early on in my career, calling out a major British brand that had moved its production overseas at that stage. Outsourcing was a big thing in the 90s. They'd moved their production overseas in order to benefit from cheap labour prices. And I remember asking them, how were they going to check what was going on in their supply chain if they really were buying things in from factories overseas? And you know what their answer was? That is nothing to do with us. If you're worried about what's going on in our supply chain, talk to our supplier, talk to our agent, not sticking here. So that was the 90s. Before the Ethical Trading Initiative was set up in the 90s, most retailers, most consumer brands actually didn't know where their products came from. If you think about the textiles world, they might buy from an agent in Hong Kong, but whether that agent was sourcing finished product from Bangladesh or from Vietnam or Cambodia, kind of guesswork. And they certainly weren't able to trace their supply chains back to the farmers, the Indian cotton farmers or the Malian cotton farmers. So there was this sense of just everything is fine in our bubble, thank you. But really, nothing was going on in terms of an understanding of these global supply chains. And then thinking about what it was like back in those days for the farmers, for the producers, the men, the women, and sometimes, yes, children, who were involved in making products for this extraordinary consumer market in the UK. What was it like for them? I think unchanged. Unchanged in generation. Producers overseas were absolutely invisible. Buyers rarely travelled. In fact, successful buying by big supermarkets and big retailers in the 90s was predicated on three things: better, cheaper, and faster. If you, as a buyer, could source your products better and cheaper and faster than the competition, you win. You would be incentivized, you would get your bonus that way. So for farmers, for workers, for the producers at the end of these supply chains, absolutely no chance. Poverty and exploitation driven by chronically low prices that had been in place for generations. That was the norm. And the associated problems of poverty and exploitation and invisibility the human rights abuses driven by those long-term exploitative practices, they were just unchecked. There was an imbalance of power, an imbalance of voice. Like I said, it was a buyer's market in the 90s. And the people who were the producers had no voice, they had no say. And then when I think about the sort of power dynamics of all of these things, at a geopolitical level, at a government level, actually it was as bad. So there was a sense that the policymakers of the world, particularly thinking about farmers, had passed farmers by. Agriculture was a sort of thing of the past. The really big, exciting innovations were services rather than farming and agriculture, financial services, big tech. I remember one particularly extraordinary case where there was a government official, who I won't name, who was getting very excited about moving Malawi, investment from the British government in Malawi to the IT sector rather than the farming sector. Just imagining that you could just magically create a world where farmers became IT specialists without any of the developmental and long-term, investments needed to make that happen. So there was yes, as I say, a sense of agriculture was a thing of the past. It was a thing to be tolerated, but not really understood, not really invested in. And then at a global level, you had, well, the World Trade Organization, which sets the rules of global trade, wasn't even set up until 95. And before that, there was something called the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, which was just a technocratic negotiating settlement. It wasn't about the people at all. And actually thinking about that, by the late 90s, by 1999, the World Trade Organization had sort of hit the buffers already in its first few years. Those of you who were around at that stage might remember the Seattle WTO ministerial, which saw the first major standoff between anti-globalization protesters and the political powers driving world trade. That so-called Battle of Seattle showed just how far and how fast globalization was changing the world for the worse. So there was a sense of the economy, this consumer economy, driving the world in a direction that increasingly people were starting to get concerned about. Increasingly people were starting to think that we may have lost our way somewhere, and people and the planet were going to be the losers. So this is very much the context in which the fair trade world and the fair trade movement was born. And boiling these things down, these two fundamental foundational problems was that primary producers in the global south, in low-income countries, had no access to fair pricing, and they had no voice. And that sense of value and voice, of price and power, is absolutely what fair trade exists to tackle. And what I want to talk to you today about is just thinking about those two really big areas. How are we getting on? How have we gone? So a little bit of a report card, if you like. So fair trade focuses on tackling the symptoms of poverty and exploitation and environmental degradation. Sorry, excuse me, the cause, not the symptoms. That's a really important clarification. Yeah, we are trying to tackle the cause through focusing on price and power. And we focus on those two pillars of exploitation because they have become systemic. They have become so embedded in the way the world works, and it needs a long-term focus to bring about that change. Unfair pricing has been normalized by the commodity trade. How can we have got ourselves into a situation where the product is more valuable than the person? There's those of you who follow the news, there's a huge problem in cocoa commodity pricing at the moment. The cocoa harvest is very poor this year in West Africa because of the climate crisis. And cocoa prices, futures prices, because cocoa is a speculated commodity, are 3 times higher than they were last year. Now, that doesn't mean the farmers are getting any more. It means the speculators, the contractors, the guys who are gambling on their laptops in London or in New York are betting on the value of this commodity in the future. How can it be that a commodity is product, not person. How can we have organized ourselves in a way that we let that happen? And as I say, it's absolutely endemic. And it's not just in cocoa. One of the things that actually shocked me in the work that I've been involved in Fairtrade is some farmers regularly run out of money in a cycle of their harvests. So if they have 1 or 2 harvests a year, the money they earn from their harvest doesn't see them through to the next harvest. And I mean, you might say, okay, that's a problem which can be solved, and it's, let's try and solve it in terms of fairer pricing or engagement. But actually, it is so structural, the running out of money, that that problem has a name in different countries. Farmers know it. They know that what it feels like. They know it so regularly. They give it a name, and the names are, I mean, shocking. In certain countries, it's called chulga, which is food suffering. Some farmers call it the months of the big stomach, because literally you can imagine, what malnutrition and what that does to you. Some farmers call it the times of silence, where money is so scarce that they simply can barely function. And absolutely extraordinary that we're at this stage in our social development that we can allow farming and food production to come to us from a situation of such absolute poverty and exploitation. I mean, to me, it's a complete scandal. So Fairtrade exists to try and tackle that. We know that the Fairtrade minimum price, which is the bedrock of the Fairtrade approach, really does help to tackle this problem by creating a level of certainty for farmers. So the vagaries of these highly traded, highly speculated commodities, just a little bit smoothed out. It's not perfect, but it provides that entry level, it provides that support, which we know from all of everything we've heard from farmers over the last 30 years, it matters to them enormously. And of course, also fairer pricing into the hands of farmers also helps them invest. I mean, it's the most obvious thing, isn't it? At a time when the climate crisis is affecting production, at a time when we really need farmers who are the stewards of the land, who are absolutely the specialists in soil health and plant health, at a time when we need to be investing in them to be able to provide for us in the future, it's unthinkable that we wouldn't be ensuring that they get a fair price. So Fairtrade has been absolutely the vanguard of something which I think is really special, which is tackling the systemic problem of long-term unfair pricing. But, how are we doing? Well, the Fairtrade minimum price of coffee, which matters so much to coffee farmers, has been higher than the world price of coffee for 3/4 of the time over the last 30 years. So for 3/4 of the last 30 years, the world price has been below the Fairtrade minimum price. That means that for 3/4 of the time, most coffee farmers around the world are earning less than the cost of sustainable production in growing the coffee that we all take for granted. At the same time, we can see that the climate crisis is affecting coffee production. We can see that, I mean, we hear it from Fairtrade farmers, that it's getting harder to farm. Coffee, as you'll know, is an altitude crop. I know there are many coffee specialists in the room. You need good rainfall, you need predictable weather patterns, and it's getting harder. So the fact that the world price is still so unfavorable to coffee production and to the men and the women and the communities who depend on that is not just a scandal morally, but it's also, it makes no commercial sense. It's absolutely impractical. And actually, looking at it from the fair trade point of view, thinking about what does the fair trade minimum price mean in coffee? Well, again, in Peru, La Florida Coffee Cooperative, the farmers there earn 50% more, guaranteed. And they plot it, and they know, and that means they don't have to take that kind of leap of faith about what they're going to get next year for their harvest. They know as a minimum they will get at least this, which means they can take some business decisions and they can plan, they can invest in their futures, which obviously is just phenomenally important. We also can see from cocoa that without a fair minimum price, without that long-term predictability, it's going to become harder for cocoa producers, and they're all smallholders, but harder for cocoa producers to make a living. Cocoa farmers, and obviously we work with cocoa farmers across the Caribbean, but also in West Africa. Most cocoa production, as you'll know, comes from West Africa. There, cocoa farmers are saying to us that they don't see a future in farming cocoa, simply because of the impact, the fast impact of the climate crisis, and the fact that prices are not keeping up with their need to invest in their farms. So, you know, we've had reports of yields being down 50% this year. And you're talking about smallholders. They've got small plots of land. And if their small plots of land are only half as productive as they used to be, it makes the urgency of giving them and ensuring they earn a living income, makes that even more acute. Not just in terms of the moral dynamic about ending exploitation, but also to make sure that there are these products in the future for us as consumers. And actually, so much of the commodity trade that people are speculating on depends on good quality production, right? So the whole thing is going to come unstuck if we don't recognize the absolute fundamental importance of viability of farmers at the first mile. So, lots to do on price. The Fairtrade minimum price is, I think, perhaps one of the most amazing inventions I've seen in the world of sustainable trade in the last 30 years. Sometimes we take it for granted, it's just there, but it does its job. And it's a wonderful benchmark to measure the vagaries and the sort of calamities of the globally traded commodity market. So that's price. And I just want to give you one little quote on this actually, which is from Leonidas, who's a banana farmer in Colombia. And it's just perfect, really. Leonidas says, before fair trade, we weren't covering our costs, which meant we had to buy less food for the household. I had either breakfast or lunch. The portions were small and they didn't leave us full. We had to measure the amount of food, the rice, the meat. Those were critical times. Nowadays, we get paid the good price. It's enough for our education and our nourishment. I mean, it's simply said right, but amazing that we have to even recognize those kinds of trade-offs. So that's price. I want to move on to power, because as I say, these two foundational challenges that we recognize: unfair pricing and uneven distribution of power. So how are we, the fair trade movement, doing in a revaluing and a redistribution of power these past 30 years? I want to start with farmer power. So every fair trade cooperative is democratically organized with clear responsibilities and rights. Producers have collective bargaining power, access to more buyers, and more control over how they farm and they trade. And we check that. We support them to get better organized, and we check to make sure that their execution and their sort of embracing of their rights and responsibilities, you know, is working as it should. The producers also, at the end of these very big complex global supply chains, now make up 50% of the decision-making rights in global fair trade. They are absolute stakeholders in the fair trade world. And we're just about to have our General Assembly where we all get together and vote, and they really do exercise control, and they do vote. The farmers and the workers in Latin America, Africa, and Asia come together and they vote on the future strategy of fair trade. It's complex sometimes, lots of languages, lots of wagging of voting cards, but it works, it's cool. Fair trade has enabled men and women at both ends of global supply chains to come together and to assert their rights to be heard. So that's, for me, a very big tip. Organizational competence, organizational strengthening, starting to build that sense of collective voice. That's really going well. There are other, perhaps more subtle ways in which I think the question of rebalancing power is starting to go in farmers' favor. I read a lot of impact reports on fair trade, and one of the things I see again and again is how people link empowerment and education. Education is power, isn't it? Of course. And there are wonderful examples. Harvest Flowers in Kenya, one of the flower farms we work with, they could see that the girls in the local schools were dropping out when it was their period. So what do? They put some of their additional fair trade premium, the money, extra money they earn through fair trade, into buying sanitary products and then they would give them out in school. What did that do? Well, 50% increase in attendance rate amongst the girls in school. Such an incredibly cheap and simple intervention. And it's got the girls back in school. It's creating that sense of educated, empowered citizenship. I mean, it's just, for me, so simple and so valuable. But I've been struck by many examples of this. I remember going to see banana farmers in St. Lucia, and there was a girls' school there. And set amongst the colonial era plantations, there was a mural on the side of the school with the words of Maya Angelou's poem, Still I Rise. I am the dream and the hope of the slave. Again, in Rwanda, there's a fabulous coffee cooperative called Dukundikawa. And of course, Rwanda has in the past grown fabulous quality coffee, and that was all thrown aside during the genocide, which of course happened exactly 30 years ago. Coffee production collapsed after the genocide, and even today, women's experiences through the genocide and after is really not talked about very much. Dukundikawa is a really interesting fair trade cooperative in Rwanda. They are now back producing fantastic, award-winning quality coffee. And the premium committee there includes a woman I met when I went to visit, quite a shy woman. And all of the other premium committee were sort of showing what they're doing with their extra funds, and she just sat quite quietly. And I asked her what fair trade means to her, and she said, I have respect. I'm listened to, and I think that's marvelous. As Papa Coca, the large cocoa cooperative in Ghana, behind Divine Chocolates, as Papa Coca has said, fair trade has made us players. And that's the point. They feel like they are players in the global system, which for too long has ignored them. Ghana cocoa producers, also from the same region as Papa Coca, now sit around a board table with very senior people from Mondelez, that big global multinational that owns Cadbury. And they negotiate and they discuss how their partnership is going to evolve. I've sat in those meetings and I've seen it happen. It is incredible. It should have always been that way, but we are making it happen between us together. It's for me, brilliant. So, farmer power, lots of interesting progress there. And then thinking about other parts of power, how are we doing reevaluating and rebalancing consumer power? Like I said, back in the 90s, we were just marketing targets. And we were just sold whatever brands wanted to sell us. Well, consumer power is changing. The beating heart of the fair trade movement has always been campaigners. I was saying how inspired I am at the Scottish Fair Trade Forum, and I mean it. And the thing which I think is utterly wonderful is just how much expertise and knowledge there is amongst campaigners across the nations of the UK and actually around the world. Around the world now, there are 2,000 or more, 2,200, I think, fair trade towns. And of course, we all know, those of us who've been around in fair trade a long time, that the first fair trade town was set up in Glasgow in Lancashire. And that was just because a small group of local campaigners decided to share the idea of fair trade and local produce. And on the back of that, guests were asked to sign a pledge to sell or use or just promote fair trade products. And following that meal, 95% of all the small businesses in the town signed the pledge. And the campaigners had tapped into something that resonates so deeply with people. A love of food, of course, but a love of fairness too. And that very simple spirit, that very simple proposition has just become this wonderful, embracing, engaging campaign. And I think now we should always be really proud of our part in building a movement which, behind the fair trade mark, which has 90% awareness amongst the British population, 80% of people trust it. And actually, even in difficult times like we've had economically recently, those numbers are going up. More people recognise the fair trade mark and more people trust it than ever before. And that is a massive success. Every single one of you who've been involved in a fair trade campaign, in whatever way you have, I take my hat off to you. It's absolutely inspirational. We are not silent, passive recipients of branding and marketing. We are active citizens. And that is something, again, which gives me huge hope for the future. So here in Scotland, I just want to give a quick shout out to some of the things you've done because they really are worth noting. Actually, also, you're also starting to tell the rest of us how to do it. So three of you three of the Scottish Fairtrade Forum are on our National Campaigner Committee, Charles being one, and directing us more and more into how we work these things in the future. So the lessons learned in Scotland are being replicated across the country. I know that Edinburgh is bidding to host the Fairtrade Towns Conference, I think next year, which would be amazing, again, as an opportunity to showcase the Scottish approach to Fairtrade. And together with Fairtrade Wales and the Scottish Fairtrade Forum are looking at redesigning what it means to be a Fairtrade nation. And my hope will be that at some point, you can tell the English how to do it too, because we're rather behind. And you're strong in schools. I noticed, for example, recently Burr Primary School in Rutherglen. Excuse me if I pronounced that one. Well, you know, there you go. I'm not going to try that one again. They only started their school campaign in 2023, but they've already run lots of events. They've just had a designer Fairtrade tote bag competition and a parents showcase. And it's just so wonderful, the energy and the creativity that people start to bring to this, just to making Fairtrade their own in their own place wherever they are. And of course, it's the 40th anniversary of the One World Shop in Edinburgh. And I was there this afternoon, and if you haven't ever been, it's a truly fabulous place because they stock so many products, but they are so committed, and to have done that through thick and thin for the last 40 years is just outstanding. I also believe the council in Aberdeen have helped link up local campaign groups and the university and businesses in the area, running a series of different events, including, I think, most recently on fashion. And that sense of bringing different parts of the community together around a common purpose, again, is something which I think is really powerful in Fairtrade and a real opportunity for us to work with. I also understand that Northlink Ferries, who run services for Orkney and Shetland, did a fundraiser for Fairtrade and have served Fairtrade drinks and used Fairtrade cotton uniforms. Really, there are hundreds of places of worship and towns and schools and communities across Scotland who have been beating the drum for Fairtrade for so many years. And I do congratulate you and thank you. And as I say, I find it incredibly inspiring. But thinking about how we're doing in terms of the power of campaigning, the power of consumers, I also, going back into England, remember a wonderful campaigner called Joe Human, who was instrumental in setting up the Fairtrade campaign in Cumbria. And he, as much as he was a fantastic advocate of Fairtrade in his community, would always say also that talking about Fairtrade enabled him to learn much more than he ever gave. It was a way of seeing the world and a way of being open to new possibilities and new people and to understanding the way the world works in a completely different way, which I thought was both human and humble, but also really valuable. Keeping with power, just a quick note on how are we doing in rebalancing buyer power. You know, like I said to you, in the 90s, it was a buyer's market. Well, it still is, okay? You know, there's no surprise there, but we are starting to balance it and check it. There are now 6,000 Fairtrade certified products, and that's because companies have been shown by campaigners and by the public that caring is good business. And of course, the social media and the internet revolution has completely opened up supply chains to scrutiny like never before. Globally, the Fairtrade movement globally have generated 200 million euros a year of extra premium. That's a lot of cups of coffee, a lot of bananas, a lot of chocolate bars, all going to make very significant differences to producers in 75 countries, 2 million producers. And if you think about it as a conservative estimate of one farmer maybe having 4 dependents, that's 10 million people engaged in this actively, benefiting from that extra additional premium, the extra minimum price from every cup of coffee, every banana. However, thinking about how do we work with buyers more in the future, British bananas now cost the same as they did in the 1980s. So they're unsustainably cheap. There's a whole conversation for us to have in the future about, is food too cheap? It's a really difficult thing to say in the middle of a cost of living crisis. But at the moment, the pricing model makes food unsustainable. So we have to think through how are we going to revalue the supply chain more than we do. Just a quick note about power of policymakers. So how are we getting on? encouraging policymakers to think differently about the power they have to shape trade. Well, you know, when Fairtrade began, we were routinely criticised. I remember being in lots of events where you'd be the kind of, you know, the awkward squad, everybody else in the room congratulating each other on their sort of free market understanding, and you'd be the kind of, you know, the sort of the grumpy ones about. The right-wing think tanks like the Institute of Economic Affairs, the Adam Smith Institute, used to criticise us regularly. I remember being in a debate once with a senior economist who objected to the fact that fair trade was denying her the right to buy non-fair trade bananas. She was saying, I should have a right to exercise my consumer choice wherever I go, and you people are trying to put standards around me. Yeah, it's a view. I also remember being in a select committee hearing where we were giving evidence on international trade, and there was another different economist who was giving evidence at that committee hearing, and we were talking about small-scale producers, family farms, and artisanal producers and handcrafts. And this person said, and what was interesting was the politicians were all nodding as she was speaking. She said, look, what is a handcraft other than a badly made item? And there was a sort of consensus around that actually industrialization and mechanization was going to be the savior of all of this. And I think that's come full circle, you know? So I think there is a sort of, that has run out of steam a little bit. Doesn't mean they've completely bought into fair trade, doesn't mean that we haven't got work to do to engage policymakers. But that old way of thinking about the world, I think it's a busted flush. The climate crisis, of course, is focusing their attention like nothing else. So yeah, a big congratulations to the Scottish government for their support of fair trade here. Big congratulations to the Welsh as well. I just wish the English were close, but then we'll get there at some point in the future, I'm sure. So I just want to have thinking about price and thinking about power. I just wanted to think about another P, pace. So we've been doing this for 30 years. You know, and reaching 10 million people, it's a big number. It's a lot of people, and we can absolutely prove through the research that farmers are better off. They are more likely to be food secure. They are more likely to have a resilient farm that can withstand the vagaries of the climate crisis. Their kids are more likely to be in school. You can see all of this from the research, but it's still only 10 million people. It's still only a fraction of world trade. And I do think the climate crisis means that all of us need to rethink about how we go faster, how do we up the pace, how do we reach more people, how do we get more people engaged with this wonderful, exciting movement. And the driver, in absolute immediate terms, is, well, it's availability of food. The UK is food insecure. We import 40% of our food. 12 to 15% of that is from low-income countries. So we don't grow bananas in the UK, of course. And if we want to have bananas in our kids' lunch boxes and in our fruit bowls, we have to pay attention to what is happening on the farm. And it isn't just grinding poverty and systemic exploitation, as enormously important as those are to solve. It's also the climate crisis affecting availability. I mean, some of you might remember the shortage last spring, roughly a year ago, of salad. There was a period when salad bags and salad products were not available in supermarkets because of shifting harvest patterns in the Mediterranean. It was just the wrong type of weather. For a short period, only a short period, the supermarkets didn't have enough salad to get. That could be the same situation with bananas. Almost half of the UK's bananas come from countries that are highly vulnerable to climate change. And we've done heat maps and we work on risks and sort of future planning with farming groups. And the same pattern in coffee, the same pattern in cocoa. We can see tea harvests being affected as well. So without wishing to be in any way scaremongering, if we value our tea, our coffee, our cocoa, our bananas in the future, and we want to be able to enjoy those products, and if the traders and the businesses that are, you know, employing people in the UK based on those products want to carry on in the future, we have got to think much more clearly than ever before about the health and welfare and viability of farming around the world. So this is the moment for us to think about farming and farmers first. So I think we need to innovate in a number of ways. Just thinking about my ambitions for the future, so we talked about price and we talked about the importance of the minimum price. But I think I would love to see farmers capture even more value at source. There are some wonderful examples of fair trade producers who have used the safety net of the minimum price and the extra working capital that they get through fair trade to invest in moving up the value chain. There are some wonderful examples that I've seen over the years. One of them was Irieli Tea, a group of tea producers in Kenya who worked with Marks and Spencer, put some of their premium in, and they set up a tea bag packing facility, which meant they could capture 60% more value at source. They weren't just exporting tea, they're exporting tea bags. There's a producer group in Paraguay called Manduvera, sugar producer group, and they used their premium to buy the first producer-owned mill in the country, because milling is where the money is in sugar. So what can we do to help and support farmers, not just to be price takers, but actually moving up the value chain and capturing more value through their processing and through their mechanization. And then on power, it's fantastic. It really is amazing that producers have engaged so much through their premium committees, on their voting rights, the governance around fair trade, their organizational competence. But we're starting to see producer entrepreneurs becoming leaders, capturing even more power in terms of leading their communities, in terms of leading negotiations in the value chain. And there's a wonderful project, as an example, called the Women's School of Leadership, which is it's simply that. It's a place for women farmers, smallholders in cocoa producing regions of West Africa to come together to share tips and knowledge. But what's amazing about that is it's been like pushing of an open door. They have so much expertise to share. They have so much knowledge they want to share, but they've just never been asked before. So now we're seeing a cadre of leaders coming through who are female, who are women smallholders. And actually they're teaching the men things. There are now men who are going through the Women's School of Leadership to learn how to farm better. So there is something there about moving from basic power in terms of your voting rights through to leadership, which I think is, again, a real hope for the future. And then just thinking about where we are with policymakers, Fairtrade has been a voluntary scheme. So, a company voluntarily engages in fair trade, farmers voluntarily engage, consumers choose to buy it or not buy it. I would love to see some of the precepts of fair trade locked into regulation. It should be illegal to be able to exploit somebody so much where you are paying them below the cost of sustainable production. Why do we need that to be done voluntarily? Wouldn't it help give all of us a lift if these things were just enshrined in regulation and good policy making? And it's fair to say, I think, that policymakers are really behind the curve on this. So because fair trade has been so successful with consumer pull and with companies voluntarily doing their bit, policymakers have kind of stepped away. And actually we need governments at the table with funding, with policy support to really help lock in the benefits and drive the next 30 years of growth. So for the future, when we can see the climate crisis really hastening the need for change, when we can see the problems that global heating is bringing into farms now, we need just to be really clear-eyed about where we've been good, where we've been successful in fair trade, and where we need to go next. Price and power are beginning to shift. You can see that through the evidence of these last 30 years. We can see that farmers and workers are starting to be able to articulate more than ever before what they need to make their farms or their jobs sustainable, what they need to be able to protect their communities and invest in the future, and to build resilient businesses. And of course, that matters to us if we're in business, it matters to us if we're consumers. So that resilience is something we are going to need because, as I say, the UK is not food secure. So this finally is in all of our interests. So just to finish up, fair trade today is the most recognised and most trusted ethical label in the UK, and that absolutely is thanks to you, to campaigners across the country who have done so much over the last 30 years to beat the drum, to persuade companies to care, to show them that it matters. Our label has helped people become curious about the origins of the food on their tables. Think about all those conversations in all of those fair trade schools around the country about where the food comes from. It's made it easy for consumers to stand up for farmers and for companies to show they care. And this matters. Even as we celebrate how far fair trade has come, we see the next challenges very clearly, don't we? Price volatility is killing sustainability. If we value our food, we must value the farmers who bring it to us. And that means sharing price and power in global trade even more fairly. And of course, as I say, it's in all of our interests to do that. As the environmentalist Jane Goodall said, you cannot get through a single day without having an impact on the world around you. What you do makes a difference, and you have to decide what kind of difference you want to make. Fairtrade has created a community of commons. It has given life to the idea that another way of trading is possible, another world is possible, that you can indeed put trade at the service of society, not the other way. That gives me huge hope. And we were talking about wet, wet, wet earlier. So as wet, wet, wet never quite said in 1994, when the fair trade market was starting out, I feel it in my fingers. I feel it in my toes. Fair trade is all around me. And so the feeling grows.
Thank you very much. Just to start with an apology to anyone online who had image or sound issues, just to confirm there was no PowerPoint, and we will have the lecture available on YouTube within the next few days. But to start off, do we have a first question for Michael?
Good evening, Michael. My name is Osman, and this is my colleague Alan. We're at the Glasgow University, and we're studying international supply chain management at master's level just now. My question this evening is, firstly, thank you much for allowing us to be here to listen not only to your lecture, but also to have the opportunity to listen to a different perspective about fair trade, which it's educated me this evening, certainly itself, and I'm sure it's probably educated other people. My question is actually two parts, if that's okay. Sorry to take up too much time. The first question is, I'm asking you this question not as an academic student, but as a father. When I go back home this evening and I see my children and I have a chat with them about how my day has gone, the first question they're going to ask me is, where did you go this evening? And I'm saying I'm going to go to a fair trade conference. And they can ask me, what is that? Now, they know about fair trade in school, what they taught, the one's 10, one's 8. But when I tell them about what I've actually learned this evening, what would you say I should tell them this evening about that? Also, what can I tell them differently to what they've probably not already heard by the teachers? So that's my first question for you.
Shall I go for that one?
Yeah.
When I talk to my kids about this, I just say, you matter. What you do matters. Your choices matter. Don't think these problems are too big to be solved. Do your bit. Find that bit that is yours at the dinner.
Thank you. And my second question is, again, as I said this from an education perspective, this evening we learned out about that, how Glasgow is a fair trade city, how it's celebrating now its 30th year, and in complete honesty, I think I was quite blindsided not to realise how much there was around in Glasgow. So now I do know, which is great, and I'll look more around it. In your complete professionalism and in your experience and with what you've understood and with the people that you surround yourself with, if we continue the pace that we're going right now, what can we see the next 30 years, hopefully, in this pace of what we've discovered?
Okay, well, if we're going to be doing much about this, I think we will see shortages of the staples that we have put into our shopping basket for years. Probably shortages that we haven't seen since the Second World War. So you won't get bananas, you won't get coffee, you won't get tea, you won't get cocoa.
Before.
Sorry?
we didn't get bananas before.
Well, right, so then there's a whole question about whether our shopping habits are going to change. You know,
No, I'm not arguing with you.
no, it's a good point though. So we've just come used to it over the last few years. That, you know, you can get bananas all year round, you can get fruit, you know, all year round. And there is a question there about whether our consumer habits are going to change. But in terms of your question about what is the immediate impact going to be, shortage of supply in major commodities unless investment in farming is structural.
Thank you, Esmond. We're going to take a question online, Martin.
Okay. Question from Steve, who says, in a combined cost of living and climate crisis, one obvious response is to use seasonal, locally produced foodstuffs. Is this a threat to the fair trade movement?
No, not at all. I mean, aren't we all trying to make sense of this crazy world that we've inherited and trying to make it a bit better? So I would say, and I mentioned the Cumbrian campaign and set up by Joe Human and others. Their campaign focus has always been Cumbria fair and local. Idea being, if you can buy it locally, buy it locally. You know, check where it comes from, check your food miles, buy locally where you can. If you want to buy something that comes from far away, from overseas, try and make it fair trade. So it's about a balance. And again, it's about each of us doing what we feel able to do in our own lives.
Thank you. And from the floor?
Thank you. Okay, my name is Dan Larry. I hope you can hear me. I want to try as much as so that you can hear me clearly. Okay, I'm from Glasgow, Carolina University as well. Master student. I'll be rounding up in the next 1 month or so. Did submit my dissertation tomorrow. Okay, so I've got to take in so much from your lecture that they are completing in my head right now. But there's one particular issue that stood out for me that I would like you to make a clarification around. I know you made reference to Sarawiwa as the environmental rights guy that was killed sometimes in 1998 by the Abacha regime. But presently, back in West Africa, in Nigeria in particular, you know, you can't count Nigeria when you're talking about West Africa. 200 million population is so huge. From my 16 months of stay in Scotland and in the UK, I tend to notice that most of the farm produce from Nigeria can't find their way into the UK. And then we happen to have in Nigeria as the head of World Trade Organization President Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. And I remember one of the issues he emphasized was quality of the produce from Nigeria, that the quality check is not okay. So as a result, is not marketable in the international community. So my main question is, you also talk around cocoa production. I know Nigeria, the West African, the southern part of Nigeria is big in cocoa production years ago. They still claim they do, but I am from that part of the country, and I know it's not as huge as it used to be. Most of the children of the farmers don't want to do. They rather want to do IT, supply chain management, business, and the rest. None of us want to stay on the farm again. And I think one of the reasons for that is because it's so attractive. We watch our parents struggle through life in poverty and the rest in the name of feeding the community or growing cocoa, and we don't get to see anything out of it. So it's not fashionable, it's not attractive. We don't want to stay there. So we'd rather sell the farm and come to the UK or go into Haiti and do what something else. However, I actually want to advise and also ask that what can Fairtrade do to farmers in less developing countries in areas of policy? Because I think most of the challenge back home is around policies. You know, it's a democratic thing. It can be forceful, but I'm just thinking that how can you influence the decisions of the government, or how can you encourage non-governmental organizations, what we call it for charities in the UK, to sort of organize and continue to encourage farming or to do more around farming in West Africa. Yeah, I know there is, okay, sorry. I know one particular organization that stood out for me in Nigeria is One Acre Fund. I don't know if you are aware of that. I know they are doing a lot around improving farmers' lives and the lives of their wards back home, but I don't think one pronounced organization in a country of 200 million can do enough. So Fairtrade, if there's a way, what's Fairtrade doing, or how can they assist in the areas of shaping policies and influencing?
Okay, well, I mean, you've asked about 15 questions in one there, but let me try and sort of give you a summary answer of this. I'm happy to chat to you outside afterwards. Fairtrade is, I mean, it's a really focused, really, productive campaign. It's quite small still, so, I was saying that we've got some way to go. What you're saying is true the world over. So, I mean, I would say it's no exaggeration to say in no country that I can think of is farming really respected and valued in the way it should be. So we've lost our way somewhere as a society by getting excited about mechanization or getting excited about IT and forgetting, the people who grow things that we take for granted every day. So farming needs to be attractive all over, whether it's in Nigeria or whether it's in other parts of West Africa or even whether it's in the UK. The average age of farmers is increasing. Farmers don't see a future in their farms. They don't necessarily want their kids to grow up farming. They are leaving their farms. There is a crisis for us in terms of how we value that. What I will say about supply chains that we get involved in is it depends on the buyer. Quite a lot of the challenge with the global commodity trade is there are sort of embedded relationships. So a supermarket may buy from a trader, and that trader may have long-standing relationships with producers in one country, not another. Where there is an opportunity is more and more, like I said, because of the risks to security of supply for the climate crisis, more and more companies are looking for farmers that are part of the future. So farming groups that are able to mitigate against the climate crisis, demonstrate they have some resilience, and of course Fairtrade does that. So don't give up. Don't think it's not possible, is what I would say to any farmer in Nigeria who's looking for market access. But there are a lot of hurdles to do with the relationships that have been long established.
Thank you. So we're going to take a couple of questions from Martin and then two more from the floor.
Okay, we've got two questions that have been here for a while, so I'll give you two different questions you can answer them. The first one is from Andrew Ashcroft, who asks, the Fairtrade Education Campaign team has done and continues to do terrific work with the consumers of the future through the Excellent Fairtrade Schools Awards. What measures does the foundation envisage taking to mitigate the impact on the ability of schools to organise annual Fairtrade activity events during Fairtrade Fortnight, following the decision to move Fairtrade Fortnight to the first half of September, i.e. the very beginning of the school year, leading to English and Welsh schools and fairly close to it in Scottish schools? So one question on that. And then the next question I have from Richard McCready is in relation to procurement. How can we encourage governments at all levels to consider items other than the basic price when it comes to procurement? For example, getting the public sector to seriously consider how producers are treated and how the means of production impacts on the environment. How can we ensure that the true value of goods is recognised? So there's two questions.
Thank you. Okay, so dealing with Andy's question first then about Fairtrade Fortnight. So Fairtrade Fortnight, for those of you who don't know, is the annual sort of peak of our focus for promoting Fairtrade. And for years it's been in the spring, and this year, to shake things up a little bit, we're moving into the autumn. And so, yeah, and I totally hear what you're saying, that some people think that's going to make it harder for engagement with schools. I mean, essentially what we're doing there is we're going to come up with multiple peaks across the year. So there will be opportunities for schools engagement at other times in the year. If it works to do it in Fairtrade Fortnight in September, that's great. If you'd rather do it at a different time of the year, that's also fine, and we will do our best to support. So that's one question. Then, sorry, Martin, the second one was?
Around public procurement, a question from Richard.
So, like I say, the Fairtrade has mostly succeeded through volunteers, companies and the public working together with farmers. Government have been behind on this. And I think there's lessons that we can take in England from what you guys are doing in Scotland, because you've already started to work on procurement here, but also there's lessons for us in the UK from what others in other countries have done. So the French, for example, the French Parliament are debating a law at the moment, a regulation about minimum price for farmers. minimum price for produce, of farming produce from France. So there is something here about understanding what is important in terms of sustainable production. The regulation is coming, and it's interesting. It could be a real opportunity for us. There's regulation in the UK at the moment around, which is in the course of being implemented, around deforestation. So companies will have to demonstrate that if they are sourcing products from areas of deforestation in the tropical belt, that they can prove these products have not been grown in deforested areas. That's forcing companies to sort of pay attention to the environmental side of their supply chain in a way they've never done before. Okay, that's really good. We need to then incorporate the same thing in terms of pricing so that the social benefits of sustainable trade are also focused on. It can be done. And there was regulation as well in the past around that we had in the UK for some time around directors' duties. You know, in 2006, the Companies Act in the UK for the first time required directors in the UK to, quote, have regards to their social and environmental impacts in their decision making. So I think there is a good precedent for saying, you know, buying is not just about cheap. It's also about environmental standards. It's about social standards, because those are really important in a future sustainable trade.
Thank you. So we have a question at the front here and then over the.
The first point isn't actually a question, it's a
Okay.
compliment. I work in the Scottish Government, and that was the best speech that I've heard
Oh, thank you.
in 10 years.
Wow.
Alex Salmon, Barack Obama. I can carry on listing if you
I'll
want.
listen all night. This is lovely.
But my problem that I have is one of my friends works for something, a chocolate company in Brazil, and they're chopping the trees down. You know what the question's going to be. I can see by your smile. What do we do about these people and they're getting shot, and they're getting victimized, and the government the government, I'm not going to say this about the Brazilian government, but they're taking money in the back pocket. Is there anything that Fairtrade can do? I'm not saying that you should be able to, because you're not a government.
Well, it's a really good point. And you know, we have to be conscious of the sort of forces going in, pushing us backwards, even as we try and make progress. I mentioned the deforestation regulations that are coming into the UK. What Fairtrade is doing is working with producers and with the traders, as well as the brands or the retailers, right across the supply chain, to ensure that each of those players is able to do their bit in ensuring deforestation. There's a note of caution there, which is, if you just approach deforestation in the way that trade has always been, you just pass the risk and the cost down the supply chain onto the farmer and saying, well, you've got to be the one who pays for segregating your products and demonstrating that they have not been grown in an area of deforestation. It's the kind of smallholders we're talking about dealing with and working within Fairtrade can't afford geolocation mapping or polygon mapping to be able to demonstrate that kind of segregation. So the brands or the retailers with more value higher up the chain need to be paying for this. And in fact, we've got a campaign on the moment in the Fairtrade Foundation to get companies and government particularly government to recognise their role also in helping to finance that. So one bit of it is regulation, compliance with regulation. So prove that your products are not contributing to deforestation. In terms of the sort of the broader agenda, that's where we need to work multinationally. You know, the UK is not going to have any chance of persuading, you know, any other government on their own. But as part of the group, as part of the whole, you know, we do stand a chance, and that's why, you know, personally, I think the UK government needs to work harder in coalition with others to promote sustainability right across the world. We'll never do it on our own.
Me and Barack Obama and you.
Yeah. That would be fun.
Seems this is the last question, it should be a real biggie, but I'll have 4 parts, and I'm not from Glasgow Cali either, so it's not going to be an academic question. I guess it's just a reflection and a question, actually. The whole fair trade thing is about having grown-up adult conversations, and there are no simple answers, and I think part of the the reality is that the world is messy. And all these decisions are messy, and people want a clean, so they want fair trade to be clean and smooth. Life and trade is not clean and smooth, but it's bumpy, and I think part of that is an honest conversation about the bumpiness of the life we live. You know, I was reflecting on the fact that, you know, for the first world in Sub-Saharan, part of the challenge is how do countries themselves and all countries look to use the products they have themselves first.
Yeah.
You know, and Scotland's a classic example. So many of the products that we excel at because of where we are, we don't eat. Instead, we import them. So you want tiger prawns, you get them from Southeast Asia, even though we're an island nation that's surrounded by seas where we export most of our seafood. And so actually the interesting notion around that, I think also to want to pick up, the question I have for you, that's it, more direct, is actually on that notion about the 10 million. Because obviously in our day-to-day lives, we come across things where people throw away the term ethically sourced. And a very nice thing of ethically sourced this and ethically sourced that. And of course, I'm not disagreeing. It just depends which ethics we're talking about, I guess. It's true, isn't it? It's true. You know, the ethics of things are quite variable, actually, and they're all valid. I just wonder from your perspective, what's the Foundation's view of the size of the ethically sourced soft market in that space? We talked about the impact of the 10 million. What's the size of the ethically sourced bigger part?
I mean, I think it's huge. I don't know the number. I think it's huge. And yeah, we've got loads of evidence to show that. I mean, you know, it's not surprising either, is that most people don't want to be part of an exploitative, ugly agenda that's making the planet dirtier and ripping people off. I mean, you know, when given the choice, people want to be part of the solution. They really do. Genuinely, they really do. And that's really encouraging. So on one level, you could say the sort of increase of the sort of ethical market is a good thing, because it means that, you know, the thing is starting to shift. The risk is you spend time in a kind of trapping around in a cul-de-sac rather than working with something which is really making a difference. So I would challenge any ethical scheme around a couple of things. The first is it independently verified? So, I mean, you know, obviously I'm talking about Fairtrade, but you know, the Fairtrade Foundation is an independent charity. We were set up by aid agencies like Oxfam and Christian Aid and CatBod, the Women's Institute, we're one of our founders. So civil society, independent, locked in from the beginning. And, you know, we maintain that independence, so we are not a company marking its own home. So is your scheme independently verified? If it isn't, how do you know you're doing enough? How do you know you're doing the right thing? There are some really good direct trade outfits coming now in coffee and in cocoa particularly. Now they may be really good, but we don't know because they're not independently verified. And they just, I mean, even the good guys miss stuff. I mean, I know from the thousands of certification audits that I've seen that we work with, even the good guys get it wrong. In good faith sometimes, you know, and so you need that independence to be able to keep people true. And then the second thing is just thinking about the need for pace. If the ethical scheme isn't driving that twin thing of environmental justice and social justice, and if they're not tackling these two problems of price and power, then you're not actually going to get much progress, I think. And it's still interesting to me, 30 years later, Fairtrade is still the only scheme, the only ethical scheme that has a guaranteed minimum price as part of its standard. It tells you something, doesn't it? This is tough work. I mean, I wish we'd reach more people. I wish it was 100 million, not 10 million. But most people, even in the ethical sort of world, don't want to talk about price yet. That's how I make back now.
Thank you very much indeed. And over to Charles.
Thank you for those interesting questions. Very big thank you to Michael Gidney for giving us such a thought-provoking and best lecture this evening. What I read from the message that you're giving is power, and the power that we have as campaigners. We have a voice to use, and every time we're thinking about fair trade, we use that voice. With elections coming up, ask a prospective candidates their views. Power to the people, not what. Thank you to the staff of the Fairtrade Foundation for their support in promoting the lecture. Thank you to Impact Art staff, our hosts, for their support with holding our event here at the Boardwalk tonight. Thanks also go to Scotland Cooperative for the Fairtrade wine that was donated, and to Sassoon and Green City Whole Foods for the delicious Palestine grapes. If you didn't taste them, they're still out there. Thank you for joining online and in person, and for your questions. And also thank you for the donations made at registration. We therefore very much appreciate it. Now, if we were on television at this point, I would say we'll take a quick commercial break. However, I'll just go ahead and reveal that our annual campaigner conference will take place in Paisley on Saturday. Yes. We're moving down the climb, but we're going to early that. On Saturday, the 14th of September, please look out for information about that. Before then, we'll also have a new website and a fresh new brand launching, so please look out for them. And finally, thank you again to you, Mike, for giving a 12th Fairtrade lecture, the best one. We wish you all at the Fairtrade Foundation the very best for your 30th anniversary celebration in the future, the Fairtrade movement. What Mike didn't say about the NCC. Karina, will you stand up, please? This is one of the other members of the NCC. By a diplomatic and very well applied set of standards. We had applications from across the country. I did not see any of the Scots ones. I did work on the English and Welsh, and we now have an NCC that we believe is fit for purpose. And going forward, we have to hold the foundation to account. You, sir, tonight were very accountable. Thank you. You did a great job for your foundation. Thank you. Sorry, those who are online, you can't come for another glass of wine or some snacks. What? Circulate, talk, and talk to somebody you've never spoken before. You have the power to communicate. Thank you.